As we talked about in the last video, Shakespeare leaves Stratford-upon-Avon around 1585, and there's no record of him until he reappears in London around 1892. So that's a span of 7 years where we don't know where he went or what he was doing. There are, of course, a lot of theories. One of the most popular being that he was touring with a company of actors where he was learning the craft that he would eventually make famous. A lot of people forget Shakespeare actually started out as an actor when he was trying to break into the theater world in London. Some reports even claim that he may have originated some of his earliest roles until his name got strong enough that he could survive solely on his playwriting and would pass the acting duties off to people like Richard Burbage. Whatever he was up to, we know that he finally reappears in London in 1892. Now, he didn't start his career as a playwright in London, but rather as a poet, and he sought the support of an aristocratic patron, in this case, the Earl of Southampton. The Earl, like a lot of wealthy men of the day, felt it was, a pleasant ornament to sponsor a playwright who would then dedicate his works to him. Again, that was a big status symbol of those days. The Earl would eventually decide to become the patron of another young poet, a man named John Furlow. And if you thought the business decision of the manager who traded Babe Ruth from the Red Sox to the Yankees was a stupid one, how would you feel if you were this guy and you sponsored a different poet over William Shakespeare? However, despite the initial setbacks, we know that by 1592 he had achieved some level of prominence in London as both an actor and a playwright. His first produced plays were all history plays. This was there to satisfy London's enjoyment of plays about its own history, as well as the rather tangled political past that they were famous for. Among his first plays produced were King Henry VI in 3 parts, meaning they are 3 full-length plays that make up one overarching narrative, so a trilogy, basically. Following that up with things like Richard II, King Henry IV, a 2-part play, and King Henry V. By 1598, he's credited with over a dozen plays. Without doubt, probably one of the high points of his theatrical career would come with the founding of his theater troupe, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which he formed alongside well-known actor Richard Burbage and popular clown performer Will Kemp in 1594. The troupe was founded shortly after the theaters had been reopened. They had all been closed because the plague had swept through London and had caused all public meeting areas to be shut down. Surely something that we, in our modern era, can in no way understand or relate to. The troupe was originally sponsored by Henry Carey, the Lord Hudson, the Lord Chamberlain. However, in 1603, the troupe was taken over and was now sponsored by King James I, and it was rechristened the King's Men. So in just 9 short years, the company had gone from a fledgling operation to being the most well-known theater troupe in existence, being sponsored by the king himself. Officially, Shakespeare is credited with writing 3 different types of plays. The first, of course, being his histories. These were the plays that were his first to be produced and his first big successes. They would include the various King Henrys, 6, 4, and 5, Richard II, Richard III, and things of that nature. Shakespeare was also very well known for his comedies. These would include things like A Midsummer Night's Dream, Much Ado About Nothing, A Comedy of Errors. He had a real gift for comedy that appealed to the common person as well as the upper class. This is funny because in most of his comedies, the upper class, whom, if you remember back to your Greek theater, must always be portrayed in a good light, The upper class in his comedies were often fools, easily duped, easily convinced of the most foolish of things, while the commoners, usually there as the source of slapstick comic relief, usually were the wiser characters and would solve the problems of the plays, sometimes through sheer luck in a very Shaggy and Scooby manner. However, Shakespeare is probably best known for his tragedies. These are the things that would become his hallmark. Shows like Hamlet, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth. Much in the same vein as Christopher Marlowe, most of Shakespeare's tragedies dealt with the dark side of the human condition. In all of his tragedies, there are times when the lead characters can turn their fate around. They can choose not to go down the path that they do, but instead continue on that path with full knowledge of what could happen. The tragedies, again, being that all of this could have been avoided. As with Dr. Faustus, a lot of his tragedies, their main protagonists are actually characters that we would, in modern terminology, consider the villains. Characters like Macbeth is a villain. He is a murderer. He is the bad guy, and yet he is the central protagonist of the play. This is in sharp contrast to the tragedies of the Greek and Roman era. As I mentioned, Shakespeare is officially credited with writing 3 types of drama. That'd be the comedies, the tragedies, and the histories. However, some literary minds like to lump a group of his plays into a 4th category. These are called the romance plays. Now, this is not romance as we define the term today. This is not a category that we would put Romeo and Juliet in. Rather, these plays share elements of both comedy and tragedy, but they also depend very heavily on supernatural elements or improbable elements, such as Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest. Some people credit this to the fact that he had a very good relationship with King James I, who really enjoyed stories of the supernatural and the macabre. All totaled, Shakespeare is credited with 16 comedies, 10 histories, and 12 tragedies. Shakespeare is also known for his sonnets. Now, this is a collection of 154 14-line short poems. The writing of a sonnet was a real trend among London's literary elite during these times. And while Shakespeare's sonnets would follow the basic guidelines that the other authors followed, the sonnet had to have 14 lines, had to have a specific rhyme scheme, had to follow a specific meter, we find that Shakespeare, again, kind of goes against the grain in terms of subject matter. Now, most of the sonnets that were being written at the time dealt with a mortal's love for a godlike figure. Shakespeare's sonnets don't quite go that way. Some historians and literary scholars believe that when you line the sonnets of Shakespeare up back to back, they're not just a collection of random poems, but they actually tell a somewhat autobiographical story. It seems that recurring themes within his sonnets have to do with a poet and a fair youth. This is a unnamed young man who has a torrid affair with a character known only as the Dark Lady. The two of them have several liaisons, and the relationship eventually ends. Now, it is believed, or rather it is a theory, that Shakespeare wrote these as actual love poems to a mysterious dark lady, so called because she is reported to have dark hair and dark skin. Who is this mysterious dark lady? We will get into that in another video. But keep this little tidbit in mind, that these poems are believed to have a double meaning as they tell the story of Shakespeare's own torrid love affair. We know that Shakespeare wrote very little after 1612, and somewhere between 1610 and 1613 he would return to Stratford-upon-Avon, where he would live in a very large house with considerable property. Of course, he was a very successful playwright. He had been buying up lands back in Stratford with the money that he had acquired. And so when he finally did retire back to Stratford, it seemed that he lived in substantial comfort. It's also said that he had a coat of arms created and hung over his house, kind of as a tribute to his father and his father's desire to elevate above the station he was born into. His son clearly did, and as that last tribute, hung that coat of arms. And he would live out the remainder of his life with his wife, his two surviving daughters, and their families, eventually dying April 1616 on his birthday. Last thing to really touch upon in the life and career of William Shakespeare was the way in which his plays were published. Of course, the printing press had been invented during the Italian Renaissance, but widespread publication was still not the norm. One, it was expensive, and two, a vast majority of the population still couldn't read, so it would be a waste of time. So the finding and publication of Shakespeare's plays was something of a miracle in and of itself. 18 of his plays found their way into publication during his lifetime, but not through official means. These smaller works are called Quartos, and the earliest one that still survives was printed in 1594. When I say not by official means, what I am referring to is that Shakespeare did not give a copy of the script to the publisher. In modern terminology, the Quartos were basically bootleg productions, much in the same way you can buy bootleg CDs and bootleg DVDs today. What we believe is that a person would go to the performance and try to write down the words as they were being performed. The result of which is that many of the plays that were published in this quarto are incomplete. Large chunks are missing. And in some cases, other poets would come in and kind of fill in the parts that were missing to kind of bridge the gaps. Because imagine, go watch a Shakespeare production and imagine trying to write down the words that they were saying as they're saying it. Longhand, you're not even able to type it up. You have to scribble it down, and you have to be somewhat covert about it, because just like a person filming a movie in the theater, if they caught you doing this, the punishment would be fairly severe. It wasn't until 7 years after his death that there was an official publication of his collected works. His plays were collected by his longtime colleagues, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, and they were published as Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. This work is what we now refer to as the First Folio. That is the first published collection of Shakespeare's works. Alright, so before we wrap this video up, I want to talk to you a little bit about what went into the creation of the First Folio, because it's kind of an amazing feat in and of itself. So one of the things that you have to remember is that as Shakespeare was writing these plays, as Marlowe was writing his plays, as Moliere would be writing his plays, all these playwrights had to do it all longhand. There were, of course, no typewriters, there were no word processors, so they had to write them out by hand. So what then do you do when it comes time to rehearse the play and the actors need their lines? Now, today, of course, you can just order a total number of scripts that you need for the production, or you can even now use digital copies and just email it out to everybody. Now, those were not options back in the day. So take a look at, look at this. Look at all this stuff. Look at it. Imagine trying to write this out longhand so that every actor in the play could have a copy of the script. Take into consideration as well that any given Shakespeare show has a huge cast. I believe the smallest cast is 14 people for the two gentlemen from Verona. So imagine at the very least having to copy all of this out 14 times for everybody in the cast to have a copy of the script. It's not a practical approach. So what they would do, as opposed to having to write out the entire play for everybody, is each actor would just be given a small packet that contained just their lines. Just their lines and the cue line, meaning the line right before it, so they knew when it was time to say their lines. This was called a side. You were giving the actors their sides. You still see this today. If you ever see behind-the-scenes footage of a TV show or a movie, what you'll sometimes see is the actors have a small little book of lines, usually with like a little ring or it's, a little flip notebook. These are just their lines for the particular scene that they're working on. So they don't have to lug around this huge script everywhere. So what this means is that when it came time to create the First Folio, what these guys had to do is they had to go around to all of these actors, collect all of these different sides, and then basically piece these plays back together one at a time using only the cue lines as kind of linking statements. And that's how we eventually get the First Folio. There would eventually be a second folio, which filled things out even more. Now, what this does, so first of all, that's just impressive that that was done in the first place. Secondly, what this does is it opens the doors for a lot of interesting theories regarding the folio. As people have studied Shakespeare's work, some things that they've noticed is that there's some inconsistencies in the writing. Certain times, plays will switch from one rhyme scheme to another, or the iambic pentameter will shift up. Iambic pentameter meaning the poetic stance in which he wrote. We're going to talk more about that in the next video. We see certain characters appear once and then disappear completely. So what this has led the theory to develop is that these are points that people have either inserted into the play, or they are the work of other playwrights, or these are things that they had to do in order to bridge missing gaps. So it's believed that even now what we would consider the complete works of William Shakespeare are not completely his work. Are they or are they not? It's a mystery we really don't know the answer to, but it is a mystery that is going to come back to us in a short while.